Well, this is a video that has been requested a number of times and has also been long promised by me, and that is a little chat about our off-grid solar power system. To set the context, we have been living with off-grid solar power for 15 years now, and over that time we've learned a few lessons, gained a little bit of experience. So in this video I want to talk about some of the pros and cons, but also first I'll go through and describe our system, describe what it contains, what we can do with it, what we can't do with it. And then I'll finish with some general observations about solar power. Now, before I really get into it, I would like to give a couple of warnings. The first is, if you're interested in Grid Connect solar, this is not the video for you, because off-grid solar and Grid Connect are very different things. The second one is that in this video I'm going to use quite a few terms that belong to the electrical world and solar world. Things like volts, amps, amp hours, watt hours, sine wave, polycrystalline, all this type of terminology. Now, if you don't know what this means, go and have a look on Google. Anything that you're not sure of, go and look it up and try and understand it from there. I'm not going to attempt to explain these terms in this video. It's not the purpose of this video. But to understand an off-grid solar system, and if you're interested in actually designing one for yourself or already have one, then want to learn how to maintain it, all these terms are things that you do need to know. So go and learn them. Okay, so what is our system composed of? What we created 15 years ago, the original system for the house, is composed of 10 solar panels with a 1250 watt total capacity. Those panels were purchased new, and at that time were really quite expensive. Solar panels have reduced dramatically in price since then. We saved money by purchasing some second-hand batteries, and what we put in was 2-volt gel batteries. We had 24 of those. Those 24 batteries created a 24-volt system that had a theoretical capacity of 1000 amp hours. But as I said, they were second-hand batteries, so I doubt they ever really had that capacity. To this we have connected, and we still have the same inverter, is a 2700 watt sine wave inverter. Now, it's an Australian made inverter, and its quality, it just works day after day without any fault. Fairly expensive unit, but really worthwhile. To back this up, as a backup power input, we had and still have a 2 kilowatt Honda inverter generator that will run a 25 amp hour charger, and so that allowed us to charge the batteries in situations where there simply wasn't enough sun, in winter when it's raining too much, like it has been a bit lately. Now, of course, we had a charge controller for this and a battery monitor. The charge controller that we had at the time was the technology of the day, which is a pulse width modulation charge controller. And everything worked reasonably well, but in winter we would need to actually run that generator when we had spells of wet weather to charge the batteries, because they would deplete, and the solar, when the sun's not shining, you're not getting much basically. So you have to run a backup power system. 3 years ago it became evident that those batteries were reaching the end of their life and I needed to replace them, which I did. After some considerable consideration, I chose to replace them with lithium batteries. There was a huge gain in terms of space going from the gel to the lithium, because the lithium is so much smaller. Also with the lithium, because you can actually discharge it to a deeper extent, we didn't need the same capacity in terms of amp hours. So I replaced those gel batteries with 3 24-volt lithium batteries. Those 3 batteries give us a total capacity of 384 amp hours. Now, I generally don't allow the system to discharge more than 1/3, at the most around 40 or 50%. Never discharge it more than 50%. That way I ensure a long life for those batteries. And they should last 10 to 15 years, hopefully closer to the 15, with that type of discharge pattern. Before I go further, I should add that the gel batteries, when I took them out of the house service, were at least 18 years old. So they had reached the expected life of a quality gel battery. A couple of months ago, I thought that I would change our charge controller technology. And so I had a little bit of a look and decided to go for a Victron maximum power point tracking charge controller. With this charge controller, I can see the charging pattern on my phone using Bluetooth and have more information about what is going on. What I learnt very quickly was that with the panels that I had, it wasn't really doing enough, and I saw the opportunity to actually increase the size of the panel system. Solar panels now are much cheaper, and it made sense financially, projected forward for the next 25 years or so, to invest into some more solar panels. And what it would mean is that we need to use that backup generator and use fuel to charge the batteries much less. So about a month ago, I added to the system another 1200 watts of power. What I added was 3 Hyundai 400 watt panels. Now these are a more modern technology. The older panels are polycrystalline. These panels are shingle cell technology and perform very well in low light. I put those onto the shed because it was easier to do that than to mount them onto the house. But they connect through a second Victron charge controller, exactly the same as the one I had already purchased. The 2 charge controllers actually synchronize via Bluetooth, and they charge the same lithium batteries. So with that second edition, we have around 2450 watts theoretical of charging capacity from the solar panels. So what do we actually run with that solar system? We run most of the general things that people have in their house. Our lighting these days is LED. Originally it was compact fluoro, but as LED came along, we moved to that technology because it uses a lot less power and gives better light, faster light. But because it is so low lighting, it really isn't a big impact on the system at all. The biggest impact on our system is the small freezer that we have. Now, we only have a small one because if we had a bigger one, we would need a larger solar system, but it's quite adequate for our family and the way we live. As I say, the fridge is the biggest power draw. One of the things with the fridge is that you cannot turn it off in winter. You have a fixed power consumption from it. It's going to use the same power basically in winter as in summer. And you can't go, oh, we don't have enough power today, the sun's not shining, we'll turn the fridge off. Fridges don't work very well like that. So it is factored in summer and winter. And so you have to design a system around maintaining fridge usage throughout the lowest time of the year. In terms of kitchen appliances, we run pretty much what most people have. We have a bread machine, as you saw in the last video. We also grind our own flour. We have a juicer, all this type of thing that we actually use. In terms of household appliances, we run a vacuum cleaner, we have a washing machine, We iron our clothes, all these types of things we still do. And of course we have chargers, computers, TV and the internet, all these that require power. I have to say though, in terms of television, we don't watch television like some people do. We don't leave the TV on, all day. It is actually probably not on very much at all. So the TV doesn't really have a big impact on our electrical consumption. Another important power draw that we have is a 24-volt pressure pump, and without it we wouldn't get water out of our taps. So there has to be power to run that at all times, but it doesn't seem to have a huge impact. Our average power consumption is around about 2 kilowatt hours per day. Look, it probably goes up and down from one day to another depending whether you're making bread or washing the clothes or vacuuming the floor, but that's probably a pretty good average. Our system produces that quite easily. On sunny days it's probably done that within the first couple of hours. When it's overcast and cloudy, then you're not going to reach that at all, and you're going to be drawing from the batteries. Now what's probably more important is what we don't run, and this is one of those things to consider with off-grid solar, is that there are some things that it's simply not worth building into the system the capacity to support because it would be too expensive. So one of the first things we don't run is electrical hot water. Our hot water is heated by 3 potential sources. In summer by a solar hot water system, in winter from our wood fire, and in between, when there's it's a little not quite summer, not quite winter, or the weather's not quite right, we have an instantaneous gas system as well. If you're in America, you'll call that propane, that comes in as a backup. So with those 3 options, we have hot water whenever we want. The other thing that we don't, in a general sense, use electricity for is cooking. Now, I did forget to mention earlier when I was talking about the kitchen appliances, is that in summer, and summer only, we are able to run a electric turbo oven for cooking. We do this in summer because there is so much more power in summer, and running that during the day, or even the impact in batteries if you run it at night, isn't an issue because you've pretty much got guaranteed sun the next day that's going to bring those batteries back up. But in winter, the capacity to do that doesn't exist. Apart from that though, there is no electrical cooking. So we do our cooking on the wood stove basically in winter, and in summer we use gas. We have a gas cooktop and oven that we use. Another thing that we don't use electricity for at all is heating, in terms of heating our house. Our house is heated by the wood fire, and that's the only heating apart from the sun in summer. A lot of people use, they use heat pumps and this type of thing, which are electrical draw, and that's really out of the question when it comes to off-grid solar power. Also, we don't have a dishwasher, and we don't have a dedicated freezer. Now, with a little bit more capacity in terms of battery and panel, we could probably run a dedicated freezer, but we have chosen not to go down that pathway and to preserve food in other ways. Now, on the shed, we have a separate system which we created later, and it's a little bit of bits and pieces. It has some solar panels that I had previous to building the house. It has about 480 watts of solar capacity on it. The batteries there are the old batteries that came from the house. So those batteries are now like 22 years old and are really begging to be replaced. They have virtually no depth in them at all now. And replacing those is probably something that I will do in the next couple of months. But when I took them out of the house, I thought I'll give them an extra life in the shed and run them basically until they are dead. In terms of inverter, in the shed I have a cheap 3000 watt inverter. Now I've found that that will run most power tools that I want to use. The only limitation, of course, is that I can't weld with it. If I want to weld, I've got to start up a big generator. It's the only way I can get the sufficient power to weld. Having described the system, I'd like to share with you some general experience of living with solar and some observations about off-grid solar power. The first really is that it's really nice to be independent, and that is the reason we chose solar power. We could have been grid connected. It was an option at the time. The cost would have been around the same in terms of an upfront cost, but of course we would have had ongoing regular costs with being connected to the grid. But it was independence really, rather than anything else, that drove me to choose solar power. And I really don't have any regrets about doing that. And you're always really pleased when you go to town or you see neighbours and you find out that the grid has been down. People say, was the power off at your place? And you're happy to say, no, not at our place because we're not connected. So that's the really nice thing about living with solar power. One other thing that you need to have in your mind with solar power is you need to be aware of your system. You need to understand your system. One of the biggest mistakes I think people make is that they migrate their grid connect habits in terms of power utilization, is that they take those grid connect habits to an off-grid system. And I think that's a big mistake. What companies will do in building systems is then offer them very expensive and big systems, when really they should be considering changing their habits and reducing their power consumption. So in terms of solar panels, we have the older array, which is polycrystalline panels, and the newer one with the shingle cell panels. You might be wondering which is the best. So earlier today I recorded some film looking at the charge controllers from each array using the app on the phone, and that gives us an idea as to how they compare. The Victron app allows you to access the records of the controllers via Bluetooth. So these ones that I've got marked house panels are the original panels that I had. We'll connect up to those and you'll be able to see what charge they've actually been bringing in. Right, currently it is overcast, but a reasonably bright overcast. You see 120 watts coming in currently. But if we look at history, then it's going to show what's come in so far today and yesterday, yesterday is interesting because yesterday was heavy overcast and we had a lot of rain. So there was only 310 watt hours came in. It was bulk charge all day. So it did not actually achieve the amount of power that we used. We probably used more power than came in. The previous 2 days it went up and achieved absorption along with float. So it fully charged the batteries on those 2 days. And you'll notice that one of these days here, it actually put quite a bit more power in than the next one. The reason being the day before, again, was a cloudy day and we didn't get much. But on every day, like back here, there is a run of sunny days and it's achieved full charge and done quite well. The maximum, it's interesting to see, the maximum amount of watts that came from that array was 948 watts, which is only a portion of the 1250 it is technically capable of. But it only did that when the battery was discharged to some degree and power was able to flow in quite freely. On days where, even though it was quite sunny, but days where the batteries were full, there was less power came in.
back here, coming back in history a little bit further, you'll see a run of days where it was overcast and some rain, but mostly overcast, and you'll see how little came in each day. But once we got some sun, it poured in and filled the batteries back up. We come back to the new panels, which I've actually installed on the shed, but they are connected to the house system. Now these panels are the Hyundai shingle cell panels, so that the cells are actually really tight, overlapping like shingles, and you'll see how much more power they're actually bringing in this overcast situation. And if we now look at the history, you'll see that they have brought in more power today already than the others. And yesterday, when it was overcast, they brought in more power than the other older panels did. And looking back on every day, they've actually produced more power than the original panels that I had. So these new shingle cell panels certainly perform better. What I notice about them is that they start producing power earlier when there's hardly any light in the morning, and they will continue to produce power until much later in the day. The only time I've seen the older panels outperform them is in the middle of the day when the sun is full strength, and that is probably because the angle of the new panels is not as good as the older panels is in terms of capturing sun.
So as you see, the newer array really does perform better. Even though the angle of the panels is not ideal, it is not really the correct angle for this part of the world in terms of capturing the best of the sun, the fact that they perform better in lower light really is making a difference, and it means that they are actually putting more of the power into the battery than the older arrays. So that's really interesting. If you're making a choice, I really like those Hyundai panels. I think they're really good and great value. Now, in terms of a general observation on solar power, I always think of solar power, particularly off-grid solar power, as being somewhat perverse in its nature. What I mean by that is that the sun and solar panels give you power during the day, the maximum heat, and this is generally the time of day when your electrical demand is at its least. When your electrical demand is at its greatest, generally at night, you're not getting anything from the solar. You have to rely on batteries. And what this means is that batteries really rule the system. Of course, you have this annual cycle too, where in winter, you're going to actually use more power because you're likely to be indoors more because of the weather, yet you're getting the least production. In summer, you're getting the most production, but you're outdoors and you're not really using the power in the same extent. That's one of the reasons we do things like have that turbo oven and utilize that in summer, because otherwise that power is simply wasted and nothing is achieved by it. So your choice of batteries is really key. Batteries is going to be the most expensive component of the system, and you're going to need to replace the batteries under current technology anyway more frequently than you replace solar panels. In fact, in terms of solar panels, while they do degrade slowly over time, you're probably not going to really need to replace them. You may need to add to them. And so really this brings us to the question of cost. With solar, there's often this illusion that, oh, you've got power for free. Well, it's not really for free. There is a big upfront cost to build a system. There is also that ongoing cost that is going to come along every maybe 10 to 20 years, where you're going to have to replace batteries, maybe upgrade components, maybe add some solar panels, after some time as they're reducing in power. So there is going to be some ongoing expense. If I was to average our system out and consider the total costs, I'd say it's costing around about $1,000 per year, but that is paid in advance in big chunks. So there was a really big chunk at the beginning, there was a big chunk when we replaced the batteries. There's been another chunk, not as big, with adding those panels, and I don't expect there to be any more big increments now for maybe another 10 years when we'll start to potentially run into the need to replace batteries. Hopefully by then there is other battery technology has come along. In terms of battery technology, my choice at the moment would be either gel or lithium. Both have very low to pretty much zero maintenance requirements. I certainly wouldn't consider flooded cells because they have way too much maintenance and you're just going to be annoyed by that in the long term. The big difference between gel and lithium, as I said earlier, is the space. The lithium takes up much less space, and that's what made me choose it. The cost at the time was basically the same, whether I went for gel or lithium, but the space was different. Now, the other thing is, because of the fact that solar does only produce when the sun shines, is that you do need a backup system. Yes, there may be some places in the world where you can pretty much guarantee you're going to get that sun all the time. But in most places, you're going to potentially run into some longer periods where the sun isn't shining. So here in Tassie, where we are, we can quite easily get a 5-day period of clouds and potentially rain where there is very low solar production. Now, doubling the system like I did has made a difference, that I don't need to run the charger and fill the batteries near as often. And I think it will now be quite rare, whereas before I was doing it quite regularly. But building a system that of course means you never have to use a backup really is quite expensive in terms of pure solar. What people tend to do is to use wind power or hydropower as backup sources. Now, both of those unfortunately weren't in the equation for us, because where we live, we're surrounded by trees. Yes, we do get some strong winds here, but because of the high trees around us, that is broken, and the wind that would be in range of a wind generator is quite choppy and intermittent, not really a good thing to generate power from. So we dismissed that. Hydro really is also a bit questionable whether we'd actually get enough power from it, because our water flow is very small, but also it's a fair way from the house. So it would be quite expensive and we would get very little from it. And because of that, it really has been better to have a fuel system with a generator and a charger. Going into the future, I don't think we're going to need to use that very much, as I said, because of the new panels, but it will still be there if and when we need it. Now, a final comment really is that if you are looking for independence with an off-grid system, you really need, as I said at the very beginning, you need to understand your own system. You need to be able to maintain it yourself. Probably you need to build it yourselves, because that's the way you're really, truly going to understand it and be able to fix it if something goes wrong. Though, of course, in terms of inverters and charge controllers, there's probably not many user fixable components in them, but to understand where the problems are, which component you need to replace, I think is really important. And that way you're going to be a lot more independent. So that's really the roundup of our system and what we have, as I said, lived with over the last 15 years. I trust that this information has been of some use to you, and if you are considering off-grid solar, you're welcome to ask questions in the comments. I don't guarantee that I can answer them all, but I can try. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back soon with another video.